Every year, a working family in New York City hands over $20,000. Not for rent, not for food, not for healthcare, just to make sure someone responsible is watching their child while they go to work. $20,000 gone before a single other bill is paid. And for years, every politician who walked through the city's neighborhoods looked those families in the eye, nodded slowly, and did absolutely nothing. Zohran Mamdani said it would be different. His critics laughed. Ted Cruz called it fantasy. Mace told him to fix the garbage first. Now Governor Hochul is at the table. The plan is real. And the question is no longer whether Mamdani was serious. The question is whether New York City is about to witness the most significant working family policy victory in a generation, or the most expensive broken promise this administration will ever make. There is a specific kind of political moment that does not get enough coverage. It is not the moment when a candidate makes a promise. Everyone covers that. It is not the moment when the promise gets attacked, ridiculed, and dismissed as fantasy. That gets covered too. The moment that gets missed, the one that actually tells you something real about a politician, is the moment when the promise shows up on a desk, in the form of an actual plan, with actual numbers, and actual signatures. That moment arrived for Zohran Mamdani. During his campaign for mayor of New York City, Mamdani said something that a lot of people in this city needed to hear, and a lot of people in the political class needed to dismiss. He said that universal childcare, real, accessible, affordable childcare for every family in New York City, was not a distant aspiration. It was a governing priority. He said it clearly, repeatedly, and without the kind of careful qualification that politicians use when they do not actually intend to follow through. The response from his critics was immediate and predictable. Too expensive, not realistic, a mayor overstepping his role, a progressive fantasy that sounds good in a speech and collapses on contact with a budget. Ted Cruz had opinions. Mace had opinions. The entire apparatus of conservative political commentary had opinions, and those opinions shared a common thread. Mamdani was performing for his base, making promises he could not keep, and distracting from the real work of running the city he was elected to manage. Now Governor Hochul is at the table. The plan is real. The partnership is in place, and the question is no longer whether Mamdani was serious. The question is whether the plan works and what it costs when it does not. This is the story of a campaign promise that became a policy proposal, the people who fought hardest to stop it, and the very real complications that sit between a signed agreement and a childcare center that actually opens its doors to a family that needs it. You need to watch this to the end, because what Mamdani and Hochul have put together has the potential to be the most consequential domestic policy achievement of this mayoral term. It also has the potential to be the most instructive failure. And understanding which one it becomes requires looking at the details that the headlines are skipping over. If you are new to this channel, subscribe now and hit the bell icon. We cover NYC politics the way it deserves to be covered, without the spin, without the cheerleading, and without pretending that complexity is the same thing as failure. Before we examine the plan itself, we need to spend serious time with the people who fought against it, not because they deserve a platform, but because understanding the opposition is the only way to evaluate whether the plan actually addresses the objections or simply moves forward in spite of them. Two names have been loudest throughout Mamdani's tenure, and both of them have something to say about childcare. You already know them from this channel. Senator Cruz has positioned himself as one of the most consistent national critics of Mamdani's governing agenda. His critique of the childcare proposal has followed a specific and disciplined line of argument. He has characterized the plan as an example of progressive overreach, a city government inserting itself into a domain that should be left to market forces, family choice, and federal or state-level policy. His argument is not primarily about the merits of childcare as a social good. It is about jurisdiction, cost, and what he describes as the fundamental incompatibility between universal government programs and functional urban budgeting. Cruz has made the fiscal argument loudly and repeatedly. New York City is not running a surplus. The budget pressures facing the 5 boroughs are real, documented, and not going away. A new universal entitlement program, one that covers every child in the city regardless of family income, represents an ongoing financial commitment that does not disappear when political priorities shift or when the economy turns. He has argued that mayors who make promises like this are, in effect, writing checks that future administrations and future taxpayers will be forced to cover. There is something worth taking seriously in that argument. Not the politics behind it. Cruz's interest in New York City's fiscal health is selective at best. But the structural point about ongoing program costs and budget sustainability is not a talking point. It is a real constraint that every serious policy analysis has to address. Mace's critique of Mamdani has been more personal and more pointed. You will remember her line from the Iran controversy, the one about constituents stepping over garbage. She deployed the same framework when the childcare proposal emerged, though with different specific language. Her argument was that Mamdani is a mayor who excels at announcing programs and struggles at governing, that the gap between his campaign promises and his operational execution is not a minor detail, but a fundamental question about his fitness for the job. On childcare specifically, Mace has argued that this is not a municipal responsibility, that the correct vehicle for universal childcare policy is federal legislation, not a city-level administrative agreement with a governor. That what Mamdani and Hochul have put together is a jurisdictional workaround that creates new bureaucratic complexity, establishes new funding dependencies, and ultimately serves the political interests of 2 elected officials more than the practical interests of the families it claims to help. She has also raised the implementation question with some force. New York City does not have the licensed childcare capacity to serve every family that a universal program would make eligible. The physical infrastructure, the centers, the trained staff, the regulatory framework does not exist at the scale the plan requires. Building it takes time, money, and a level of administrative competence that she has openly questioned whether this administration possesses. Here is the uncomfortable truth about both of these critiques. Neither Cruz nor Mace has engaged seriously with the substance of what Mamdani and Hochul have actually proposed. Their arguments have been framed at the level of general opposition, too expensive, wrong jurisdiction, bad administration, without drilling into the specific mechanisms of the plan and evaluating whether those mechanisms address the problems they are raising. That is a political posture, not a policy argument. And the difference matters, because a political posture can be dismissed when you disagree with the person making it. A policy argument has to be answered on the merits, even when the person making it is acting in bad faith. The specific objections Cruz and Mace are raising deserve specific answers, and the plan that Mamdani and Hochul have put forward either provides those answers or it does not. Start with what Mamdani actually promised, because the distance between campaign language and governing reality is the first measurement that matters. On the campaign trail, Mamdani talked about universal childcare with a clarity that his supporters loved and his critics called reckless. He said that no family in New York City should have to choose between working and caring for their children because they cannot afford the cost of childcare. He said that the affordability crisis is not only about rent, it is about every line item in a working family's budget, and childcare is one of the most brutal. The average annual cost of childcare in New York City exceeds $20,000. In Manhattan, it is significantly higher. For a family earning the city's median household income, that figure represents a staggering share of their take-home pay. For families in the lower income brackets, The families Mamdani built his political identity around representing, it is not a financial strain. It is a barrier to participation in the workforce entirely. His campaign promise was that this changes, that a Mamdani administration would pursue universal childcare as a concrete policy goal, not a distant aspiration. Now here's what the plan that emerged with Hochul actually contains, and why the governor's involvement changes the political and practical calculus entirely. The partnership between Mamdani's city administration and Hochul's state government solves two problems that would have made a purely municipal childcare program nearly impossible to sustain. The first is funding. A universal childcare program at the scale of New York City requires a financial commitment that the city's budget on its own cannot absorb without making painful cuts elsewhere. The state's participation brings a funding stream that is both larger and more stable than anything the city could generate internally. It also creates a pathway to federal matching funds that are available to state-administered programs, but not directly accessible to municipal ones. The second problem it solves is the jurisdictional argument that Mace has been making. When the program is structured as a city-state partnership, rather than a unilateral mayoral initiative, the question of whether a mayor has the authority to create this kind of program becomes largely moot. The governor of New York has clear authority in this domain. Her partnership with the city legitimizes the program at a level that a mayoral executive order alone could not achieve. This is why the Hochul involvement is not just politically significant. It is structurally essential. It is the difference between a program that exists and a program that can survive a legal challenge, a budget fight, or a change in political leadership. Now, I need to stop for a second. If you have watched this far, please like this video. This is not a simple story, and it does not compress into a headline, which means the algorithm is working against it. Your engagement is what gets this kind of detailed, honest analysis in front of more people. Write your thoughts in the comments. Do you think this plan is the real thing, or is it another announcement that will quietly disappear before it reaches the families who need it? I read every comment. The plan itself works in 3 distinct layers, and each one deserves attention. The first layer is eligibility. The proposal as structured covers children from birth through age 5, which is the window where childcare costs are highest and the developmental stakes are greatest. The universal framing means that eligibility is not means-tested in the traditional sense. It is not a program for families below a certain income threshold. It is a program for families in New York City. That universality is both the plan's greatest political strength and one of its most significant fiscal complications, which we will get to in the next section. The second layer is financing. The state-city partnership allocates costs across multiple funding streams. The state contributes the largest share, drawing on existing early education infrastructure and new appropriations negotiated as part of the Hochul-Mamdani agreement. The city contributes a matching portion from its capital and operating budgets. Federal funds flow through the state mechanism, taking advantage of existing federal early childhood programs that can be expanded to cover a universal municipal model when the state is the administrative partner. This financing structure is more durable than anything a purely city-funded program could produce. But it is not invulnerable. It depends on the state maintaining its commitment, which depends on Hochul's continued political alignment with the program and the continued availability of state budget resources. Neither of those things is guaranteed over the multi-year implementation timeline the plan requires. The third layer is the delivery infrastructure, and this is where the plan moves from a political agreement to an operational challenge that will determine whether any of the first 2 layers actually matter to a real family trying to find a childcare spot for a real child. New York City currently does not have enough licensed childcare capacity to serve the population that universal eligibility would create. The gap is not a minor shortage that can be addressed through administrative optimization. It is a structural deficit that requires new physical space, trained and licensed staff, and a regulatory expansion that takes time regardless of how much political will and funding is behind it. The plan includes provisions for building out this capacity, new center grants, workforce training programs, licensing pathway expansion, but the timeline for that build-out is measured in years, not months. This is the point where the plan's ambition and the plan's reality most visibly diverge, and it is the point that both Cruz and Mace have touched on, even if their motivations for raising it are primarily political rather than substantive. Bolum 4. RTVXC Larry. Let us go through the honest accounting. Not the campaign version, not the opposition attack version. The version that a working family in the Bronx or Brooklyn or Queens deserves when they are trying to understand whether this plan will actually change their lives. Start with what the plan gets right, because there is a great deal here that deserves genuine recognition. The most immediate and concrete benefit is the financial one. $20,000 a year is not an abstraction. It is the difference between a parent staying in the workforce and leaving it. It is the difference between a family building savings and a family spending down everything they have on care costs before a single other expense. For the working class and middle class families that form the core of New York City's population, the elimination of that cost is not a quality of life improvement. It is an economic transformation. The research on universal early childhood programs is among the most consistent in social science. Children who receive quality early care and education show measurable improvements in cognitive development, school readiness, and long-term educational outcomes. The benefits concentrate most heavily in lower-income households, where the alternative to a quality program is often no structured care at all. A universal program that reaches those households at scale is not just a political achievement. It is an investment in the next generation of New Yorkers that pays returns measured in decades. There is also an economic argument that goes beyond individual families. When mothers, and it is disproportionately mothers who reduce workforce participation due to childcare costs, can stay in or re-enter the workforce, the economic contribution is significant and measurable. More workers mean more tax revenue, more consumer spending, more economic activity. The fiscal cost of a universal childcare program is partially offset by the economic activity it unlocks. Not fully offset, but partially. And that partial offset matters when you are making the budget case for a program of this scale. The Hochul partnership adds another layer of value that is easy to overlook. By linking NYC's childcare expansion to a statewide framework, the program becomes more resilient. State-administered programs are harder to dismantle unilaterally than city programs. They have more stakeholders, more funding protections, and more legal infrastructure around them. Mamdani has not just created a program. He has created a program that is structurally harder for a future administration hostile to it to simply undo. Now the other side. And this is where the analysis needs to stay honest, even when the honest answer is uncomfortable for people who want the plan to succeed. The universality that makes the plan politically powerful is also what makes it fiscally complex. A universal program, one that does not means test eligibility, costs more than a targeted one. The families who do not need the subsidy, who would have paid for childcare out of pocket regardless, now receive a public benefit. That is a feature of universality, not a flaw. Universal programs tend to be more durable politically because they have broader constituencies. But it is also a real cost, and that cost has to come from somewhere. The current financing model depends on the city-state partnership holding. That partnership is between two elected officials who share political alignment at this moment in time. That alignment is not a permanent condition. Political relationships between mayors and governors in New York have a long history of fracturing under budget pressure, competing priorities, and electoral cycles. If the relationship between Mamdani and Hochul deteriorates for any reason, political or personal or fiscal, the funding structure that makes this program viable becomes unstable. The implementation gap is the most pressing near-term problem. Even if the money is there and the political will is there, the physical capacity to serve a universal population does not exist yet. That gap will be bridged over time, but during the bridging period, there is a risk that the program creates expectations it cannot immediately meet. Families who become eligible under a universal framework and cannot find a spot in an available program do not experience that as a work in progress. They experience it as a broken promise, and the political cost of that experience falls on Mamdani directly. There is also a workforce question that the plan addresses, but does not fully solve. Childcare workers in New York City are among the most underpaid workers in the professional care sector. Building out the capacity the plan requires means hiring thousands of additional workers at a time when the labor market for that workforce is already tight. The plan includes wage support provisions, but the gap between what the plan offers and what would be required to attract and retain enough qualified workers at scale is a real implementation risk. The Ted Cruz fiscal argument deserves a direct answer here, even if Cruz himself is making it in bad faith. The long-term budget commitment this program represents is substantial. It is not a one-time expenditure. It is an ongoing obligation that will exist in every future city budget for as long as the program exists. That is true of every significant public service. It is true of the subway, of the public schools, of the police department and fire department, and every other infrastructure of city life. The fact that it is an ongoing commitment is not an argument against the program, but it is an argument for building the most durable and efficiently administered version of the program possible, and for being honest with the public about what the budget trade-offs look like over a 10-year horizon. Mace's implementation concern, similarly, deserves a direct answer rather than a political dismissal. She is not wrong that the gap between an announcement and an operational system is where most ambitious government programs run into serious trouble. The question is not whether the gap exists, it does, but whether this administration has the operational competence to bridge it on the timeline the plan sets out. That question is genuinely open, and the answer will emerge over the next 2 years as the program either builds out its capacity or falls behind its own projections. Here is what this moment actually means, stripped of both the promotional framing and the opposition attack framing. Mamdani made a specific promise to a specific constituency about a specific problem. The problem is real. The constituency is real. And the promise has now taken the form of a concrete policy partnership with the state government. That is not nothing. In a political environment where campaign promises routinely dissolve on contact with governing reality, a mayor who reaches a signed agreement with a governor on a program of this scope has accomplished something that deserves serious acknowledgement. But acknowledgement is not the same as evaluation, and the evaluation is still pending. The plan is real. The funding structure is more durable than a purely city program would have been. The Hochul partnership addresses the jurisdictional critique that Mace raised and provides financial architecture that the Cruz fiscal argument, at least partially, has to contend with. Mamdani has moved from campaign language to governing action on this issue, and that movement is meaningful. What is not yet resolved is whether the operational execution will match the policy ambition. Government programs at this scale fail most often not because the idea was wrong, but because the implementation was underfunded, understaffed, or undermanaged. The childcare workforce gap is real. The physical capacity gap is real. The budget dependency on a political partnership that could change is real. For the families in New York City who need this, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, paying $20,000 a year for care they can barely afford, making impossible choices between work and family every single day, the plan's success or failure is not an abstraction. It is their life. If it works, Mamdani delivers something concrete to the most important constituency in his coalition. Working families who came to him with an affordability crisis get a real, durable, meaningful answer to one of the biggest line items in their budget. That is the strongest possible case for his administration, and the strongest rebuttal to every critic who said he was all promise and no delivery. If it does not work, if the capacity gap does not close on schedule, if the Hochul partnership frays under budget pressure, if the program creates eligibility without availability, then Cruz and Mace will have their argument. Not the argument they are currently making, which is primarily political. The real argument that the gap between ambition and execution is what defines the difference between a politician and a governor. Mamdani has closed the gap between promise and plan. The gap between plan and reality is still open, and the people who will close it or fail to close it are not the politicians who announced it. They are the administrators, the childcare workers, the licensing officials, the budget analysts, and the families trying to navigate a system that is being built around them in real time. That is the honest version of this story, not the victory lap, not the cynical dismissal. The version where a real policy is in place, real problems remain, and the outcome is genuinely undetermined. What do you think? Is this the moment Mamdani proves that progressive governance can actually deliver at scale in one of the most complex cities on Earth? Or is this the beginning of a long implementation story that ends with a program that helped some families but never reached the universal promise it launched with? Leave your answer in the comments, because the families who need this program are not waiting for the political debate to resolve. They are paying $20,000 a year right now and watching to see whether anyone in city government is actually going to change that. This story will be here every step of the way. The implementation timeline, the budget negotiations, the capacity build-out. Every development that tells us whether this plan is the real thing or whether it joins the long list of New York City promises that looked different at the press conference than they did at the kitchen table. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and watch the previous video on your screen to understand the full context of how Mamdani has governed since taking office, because this childcare plan does not exist in isolation. It is part of a larger story about what kind of mayor he is choosing to be.